Hello, and welcome to this latest webcast. My name's Rebecca Harding. It's the end of February, and 1 year on from the start of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, this webcast asks, where will it all end? I was asked this question at an event a little while ago, and it occurred to me that it's underexplored outside of military circles. It's very easy to see the conflict as purely a military one. Ukraine's conventional fight to win versus Russia's more total war approach, which is a fight to control as well. After President Biden's 21st of February speech in Warsaw and Vladimir Putin's State of the Nation speech at the same time, it's very hard not to use the terminology and diplomatic rhetoric of the Cold War. Yet at the moment, this isn't a nuclear showdown between two great powers. Despite the press and political rhetoric that we have, which is increasingly painting it as inexorably leading in that direction. At the moment, it seems we are talking about zero-sum, winning and losing. General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said Russia has lost strategically, operationally and tactically. But the military side, even if Russia has not performed as well as expected, is not the whole picture. Because of the potential for escalation into nuclear conflict from the outset, the West has used very different strategies to constrain Russia's military action than it would have done had there not been a nuclear threat. The economic approach that's been taken is also a test case should China take action in Taiwan. In short, it's recognition of the fact that great power conflict is well and truly back on the table, but its nature has become geoeconomic and not just geopolitical, and this makes it very hard to end. So let's look first at the weapons that the West has used. Sanctions, export controls, financial restrictions and technological restrictions to constrain Russia rather than fight wars directly. The whole idea has been to restrict Russian access to funding its military operations and investing in its military operations in the future. And this has been done in three ways. Deterrence from further action by limiting access to Western military technology, trying to decouple Russia from the global trade and financial systems, especially by reducing Europe's dependence on energy from Russia and restricting access to the SWIFT messaging system and global financial markets, and then finally by limiting access to technology. Now, the Russian economy has actually outperformed expectations, showing the limitations of all of this approach in directly restraining or deterring an adversary in the short term. But it's also a war that is being fought through economic means, and this is much harder to end because what it's doing effectively is interpreting economic measures as a security threat, economic power as a security threat too, and strategic competition as valid reasons for taking action. This changes the whole post-war order and makes conflict perpetual. Arguably, no one side can win, but any one side can gain primacy at any point in time. So here are the three reasons why it's so hard to fight a war like this. First, let's look at the conflict in hand, Russia-Ukraine. To reach a solution, both Russia and Ukraine need to win. In military terms, this means allowing Russia to have some kind of an off-ramp, given its territorial gains since February 22, that doesn't leave an open wound, making conflict more likely and Russia's dissatisfaction perpetual. Second thing it needs to do, of course, is allow Ukraine to define the terms of the peace. But in diplomatic terms, these are pretty irreconcilable. Can Ukraine be allowed to regain the territories it lost since February 22? Can it be persuaded to let Crimea go? Can Russia accept that Ukraine needs to keep most of its territorial integrity? These are imponderables and to some extent mean that this war is difficult to win anyway. One potential way of reconciling both is through an economic reconstruction package for Ukraine post-conflict. But perhaps more importantly, given the need to deter in the future, it's also about Russia's economy. And this is much harder to do. Mr. Putin regards economic threats in the same way that he regards military threats as existential. Any sustained economic exclusion makes it more likely that Russia will still have an axe to grind. It is not a deterrent unless there is some kind of compromise that both sides can live with, but equally a threat that neither side can live with. In other words, the trade equivalent of mutually assured destruction. And that would be economic disaster. It's also very hard to define because it'll mean dismantling the whole global trading system and perhaps escalating as well to other countries like China. That's not in anyone's interest and, more importantly, would be very hard to get unity on or maintain unity, especially because countries like Japan and Germany have a very great dependency on the global trading system. So the second reason is that economic isolation and decoupling could potentially go too far. The great power competition that is emerging from the crisis as it goes into its second year is not confined to geopolitics. Let's have a look at what that means. Geopolitics is a competition between nations for borders and resources. It's fought in conventional ways with trade as a potential lever. Geoeconomics, on the other hand, is a competition between states for primacy over economic security of nations. The Russia-Ukraine crisis pushed up energy prices, which pushed up inflation, meaning that the total war was actually an economic one too, with serious collateral damage in allied nations. Russia has been prepared for all of this and has built bridges with emerging Asia, Africa and China through its energy supplies, its food supplies, and equally supply of weapons into Africa. Any sustained isolation serves only to increase Russia's influence in a decoupled world on East and West lines. Any escalation puts dollar hegemony at risk, and although this seems a distant possibility at present, remember how much of the last few years has been completely unpredictable. And the third reason is China. China's power at the moment is a quest for global economic supremacy or primacy, and that is a main lever of economic policy as well as foreign policy. China throughout all of this is and has been an elephant in the room. Its approach is to hide its light and bide its time. It hasn't explicitly backed Russia, although its position is becoming increasingly ambiguous. And this matters because the battle lines at present between China and the US are largely in terms of trade, technology, and access to investment finance. And they're operating through the levers of export controls, trade restrictions, and access to US technology. But this is very hard to unravel. The world is dependent on Chinese exports of semiconductors, for example, consumer electronic parts, components, computers. These are integrated into products that we all use on a daily basis. China is the world's largest exporter, and despite the slowdown because of supply chain blocks and zero COVID policies, in 2021 its exports were nearly twice that of the United States. China controls nearly 85% of all lithium production around the world, and we need that for electric vehicles. And China is in the top 2 or 3 import partners for nearly every country in the world. So if the US and its allies use similar tactics against China, it could potentially do untold economic damage unless all of that dependency could be reversed. The nature of modern conflict is inherently built on the need to constrain adversaries rather than to win in the future, I am arguing. The Russia-Ukraine crisis will require compromises on both sides in terms of territory if there's to be any kind of diplomatic solution, and at present this seems very unlikely. Meanwhile, Russia and China could potentially build renminbi-based and digitally based routes to expand energy supplies eastwards and create a new Silk Road between China and Russia that builds an economic primacy for China at the same time. The Allies have no choice but to constrain Russia in the current conflict with economic means, but this diverts economic activity by Russia elsewhere. Full decoupling may take some time, but meanwhile we're moving away from conflict defined purely in military terms to sub-threshold or hybrid conflict, where the quest is for dominance but not supremacy. So I'd argue that modern conflicts can never be won. They're about constraint rather than war fighting. They're about surrounding your enemy rather than blasting them off the map. In short, they are no longer zero-sum in wars that can only be contained. They may never be declared, and certainly not won. Thank you for listening.